And today, it's kind of, where does science meet theology, meet philosophy? And the book is Why Does the World Exist? By Jim Holt. Holt is a critic on philosophy and math and science, and writes for the New York Times Book Review and the New York Review of Books. And so he reads for a living all of these science books and philosophy books and math books and also a lot of theology, and has had, by his own telling, a lifelong interest in the question of why does the world exist? Do you ever think much about why the world exists? I don't think a whole lot about it. Why is there something rather than nothing? I think most of us have other things we worry about from day to day than that. But there are people that are living and working on the cutting edge of those kinds of questions in science and philosophy. And Holt says that he's spent his whole life kind of thinking about it. Why are we even here? And, you know, it could have been that nothing existed, and yet we do exist, and is there a reason that we exist? And so what he does with this book is that because he has all of these contacts, he reviews all of these books and has been doing it for many, many years, he decides to go around and ask all of these people that he's interviewed over the years in all these different fields and ask them to spend some time thinking about it and talking to him about why does the world exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And it's interesting. It's also sometimes funny because he often reviews books critically, and when he asks people to talk with him, some of them just say no, they're angry with him because of his reviews, and some of them want to use the opportunity in the interview to argue with him about what he said about their books. But most of the interviews are quite interesting. And of course, he says, you know, he begins the book by talking about prior to the modern era. Prior to the modern era, everyone assumed that behind the world that exists as they know it or as they knew it, there stood some kind of a creator who put it into motion. And he talks about Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. I mean, they lived in a world where there were gods, many gods, not just one god, but you know, Aristotle used the logic that he helped to develop to reason back causes. You know, everything has a cause, and you can reason back cause to cause to cause to cause to cause, and eventually you get to the first cause. And the further back you get in that reasoning, the more close you get to perfection. And Aristotle reasoned that there had to be a beginning, a first cause, the unmoved mover, who set the world in motion. In most of the world's religions, there's a creation myth. And every creation myth tells the story about how that world came to be and about the god or the gods that started it off and got it started. In the biblical creation myth of Genesis, in the beginning, Genesis starts out by saying there is this formless void. The Hebrew is tohu vabohu, which is a great phrase in the Hebrew. One of the few I can pronounce, by the way. And the interesting thing about that is that it's something. In the Genesis story, there's something there. It's translated as the formless void. It's actually literally this watery chaos existing in the darkness. So that's there. And in the midst of that being there, for however long it's there, God, the creation act in Genesis is the story of God taking that formless void, which is chaos, and bringing order out of it, and separating out the water and the land and the light from the darkness, and then creating life that brings order, further order out of the chaos, culminating in human life, which is tasked with bringing more order out of the chaos. And of course, then the biblical story, the further telling of that story is how we make a mess of that all the time and have to be straightened out. But the interesting thing in terms of this story is that when the Christian thinkers, the early Christian thinkers, began to interact with the Greek and the Roman world and with the philosophy that was there, they were a little bit troubled with this creation story that they had from Genesis, because as they encountered the idea of perfection, an unmoved mover, and everything that was there in Greek thinking about perfection and God, they were troubled by the notion that God perhaps had messed up the first time. I mean, where did this formless void come from? Where did this chaos come from? Someone must have created it. And either there was another God who created it before the God of the Hebrews created it, or that God, the Jewish and the Christian God, tried once and messed up, and then had to think about it a while, and then got his act together and created again. It's sort of like the Adam and Eve story. You try once, and you kind of mess up, and then you get it right the second time. That's humor that was lost on apparently everyone. Anyway, so however you think about it, the Christian theologians came up with the idea of creation out of nothing then. That God, there was nothing there. That out of the love of God, out of the mind of God, from nothing came the creation of the world, which was initially perfect, as God was perfect. And that has been standard Christian and Islamic theology ever since. And for most people in the world who are part of religious communities, wherever they are in the world, their creation story, and they're thinking about the beginning of all time, and who's there at the beginning, still includes a creation story and a God who's there. But the Western scientific method has led many people down a different path, and that's the primary story of this book. It was Einstein whose calculations accurately predicted that there was a different kind of starting event, what would eventually become known as the Big Bang. And the Big Bang was a term actually used derisively by those who thought that was a stupid idea, by the scientists who thought it was a stupid idea, who assumed that as old as the Earth was, we came to know the Earth was, and as old and expansive as the universe was, that it was always there, from beginning to end. But Einstein, when he did his calculations, what came out of those calculations, the theory of relativity and everything came with it, was that the universe had to be expanding. And his calculations predicted this. And that suggested that as things were moving away, at one time they had been closer together, and that space-time came together in the distant past, and there was a starting point. And the funny thing is that Einstein was very troubled by his own calculations. He didn't believe it. He thought he had to be wrong. And so he did something that was unscientific. He interjected into his own theory a corrective measure that took out the beginning and the expansion and made his theory into what was known as the steady state theory. Because he just assumed that the universe had to be always the same from beginning to end. And then once the actual science caught up with Einstein, and we began to get those background radiation measurements out there that suggested that indeed the universe was expanding. And then they began to speculate about that Big Bang as being something that was really real. Einstein had to retract that corrective part of his theory, and would later say that this was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life. That he didn't allow the science that he actually saw to lead him, that he was afraid of the science, and made a change to it. But then one of the interesting things about that is that with the steady state theory, which developed for a long time in the scientific community, that really did away with the need for any kind of a God. Because if things have always been there, then there was no one to create it. It's always been there. And so God is kind of out. There's no gap, and so there's no need for a God of the gaps. And God is out of the picture. But once Big Bang comes back in to the picture, and that becomes then the standard scientific theory of the beginning of everything, then that leaves room for lots of people to say, there's a beginning. What was there before the beginning? Who was there before the beginning? There had to be someone there to get it all started. And so some people continue to postulate a God. And there's his book, when he talks to some philosophers and some theologians who are very versed in scientific readings. I'm not. Reading this book makes my brain hurt, I have to say. There's a lot I don't understand. I have to read it over and over and over again so I can understand a little bit. He talks to an Oxford philosopher, Richard Swinburne, who is a frequent sparring partner with Richard Dawkins, one of the famous atheists out there who's writing books about why we don't need God in the order of things. And Swinburne talks with him a lot. They teach together, and they disagree. But Swinburne, he just says, the scientific principle is that you seek for the most simple and elegant solution to every problem. And as you move back in time, the most simple and elegant solution to the problem of existence is to suggest that there's a God who got it all started, which drives Dawkins nuts. But so